In 1928, a group of American entrepreneurs walked into Brixton, South London, with an idea nobody in Britain had quite seen before. Nothing in their new shop cost more than a shilling. By the 1970s, that little shop had become something else entirely. British Home Stores, BHS, a name stitched into the memory of nearly every family in the country. The toy department at Christmas, the pick and mix counter, scooped by hand into paper bags, the home furnishings aisles where young couples chose their first curtains, their first crockery, their first grown-up life together. For 88 years, BHS stood on the high street as something close to permanent. Then, across a matter of months in 2016, all 164 stores closed their doors for good. 11,000 people lost their jobs. A pension scheme meant to protect thousands of workers was left with a hole of more than £500 million. How does a company that survived 2 world wars, a dozen recessions, and nearly a century of change collapse in barely a year under new ownership? This is the story of what was built and who took it apart. Long before it became a byword for British high street shopping, British home stores began as an American gamble on English soil. In 1928, a small consortium of entrepreneurs from the United States, familiar with the runaway success of the 5 and 10 cent stores back home, looked across the Atlantic and saw an opportunity that British retailers had not yet seized. Woolworths had already proven that fixed, affordable pricing could pull working people through the doors in their thousands. These American investors believed the same formula could work again, in a country still finding its feet after the Great War, where household budgets were tight and every penny had to stretch further than the last. They chose Brixton for their first store. It was not London's grandest address, but it was alive. A working-class district in the south of the capital, densely populated, full of families who needed practical goods at honest prices and had little patience for anything grander. The founders understood their audience precisely. This would not be a store for silk gloves and imported perfume. It would be a store for the people who kept Britain running. The idea at the heart of British home stores was almost defiantly simple. Nothing on the shelves would cost more than a shilling. Not a shirt, not a set of cutlery, not a length of curtain fabric. In an age before supermarkets, before easy credit, before the very idea of one-stop shopping had taken hold in Britain, this was a genuinely radical proposition. Walk in with a few coins in your pocket and walk out with something useful for your home. When the doors opened that year in Brixton, the shop itself was unassuming. A single-level space, shelves stacked close together, the smell of new fabric and fresh paint still hanging in the air. There was no grand unveiling, no society photographers, no fanfare befitting a store that would one day become a national institution. What there was instead was a queue of local shoppers curious to see whether the American promise of low prices was really true. It was. Housewives from the surrounding streets came first, drawn by word of mouth, and left having spent shillings that would have bought far less anywhere else. Factory workers picked up replacement crockery without a second thought about the cost. Young families, setting up their first homes in an era of modest wages, found in British home stores something they had rarely been offered by British retail before: dignity at an affordable price. The founders' belief, unspoken but evident in every decision they made, was that ordinary people deserved good, honest goods without having to save for months to afford them. Within a year, the shilling ceiling had already begun to strain against the ambitions of a growing chain, and prices crept upward to 5 shillings as home furnishings joined the shelves. But the founding instinct never disappeared. British home stores would spend the better part of a century as a store, built not for the wealthy, but for the vast middle of British life. The families who wanted quality without extravagance, and who would in time come to regard this American import as something entirely, comfortingly British. What began in a modest Brixton shop front was about to become something far larger. By the time the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, British home stores had shed almost every trace of its origins as a humble variety shop. It had grown into something the founders themselves might scarcely have recognized. A fixture of the British high street with 94 stores and 12,000 staff, standing shoulder to shoulder with Marks and Spencer as one of the names every family knew by heart. This was the golden era, and it would stretch through the 1970s and into the 1980s, a period when walking into a BHS store was not simply an errand. It was a ritual. For children across Britain, the toy department was the closest thing the high street offered to magic. Every November, the shelves filled with dolls, train sets, board games, and stocking fillers, and the department took on a hum of anticipation that built steadily toward Christmas. Parents brought their children in not just to buy, but to look, to wander the aisles making mental lists, to press small noses against glass counters, to negotiate quietly over which single toy might make it under the tree. For a generation of British children, the memory of BHS at Christmas was inseparable from the memory of childhood itself. Just as vivid in its own quieter way was the pick and mix counter. Long before supermarkets turned self-service sweets into something ordinary, BHS offered shoppers the simple pleasure of filling a paper bag by hand. Cola bottles, fizzy dummies, chocolate eclairs weighed out at the till and handed over in a twist of white paper. It cost pennies, but it bought something more valuable than sugar, a small, reliable joy that punctuated an otherwise practical shopping trip. The store's transformation deepened in the early 1980s, when a global recession forced British home stores to confront an uncomfortable truth about its own image. Beside the polish of Marks and Spencer, BHS had begun to look tired, dependable perhaps, but unmistakably dowdy. The company's response was to bring in the designers at Conran Associates, the very people shaping Habitat's clean modern aesthetic, and ask them to reimagine what a BHS store could look and feel like. Shop fronts were opened up, layouts were simplified, home furnishings, curtains, bedding, kitchenware were given room to breathe instead of being crammed onto overstuffed shelving. Walking into a revamped BHS store in the mid-1980s felt different, brighter, more considered, more like a destination than a necessity. That same decade, British home stores ventured into an entirely new kind of retail experiment, joining forces with the supermarket chain Sainsbury's to launch Sava Centre, vast American-style hypermarkets that combined groceries with general merchandise under one roof. For shoppers used to smaller high-street premises, a Sava Centre trip was something close to an event, an entire Saturday's errand compressed into a single sprawling building. It was ambitious, and it was proof that BHS, at its peak, still believed it had room to grow into new formats and new decades. Behind the counters, the experience of working for British home stores carried its own quiet pride. For many staff, particularly women who had left school at 15 or 16, a job at BHS meant steady hours, a proper till to learn, a uniform to wear with a certain sense of belonging. Long-serving staff came to know their regular customers by name, remembered which children had grown out of which shoe size, kept half an eye out for the mother who always came in on a Thursday after collecting her family allowance. It was a relationship built slowly over years between a shop and the community that depended on it. For families up and down the country, BHS became woven into the small ceremonies of ordinary life. A wedding list quietly assembled in the home furnishings department. School shoes bought every September without fail. A new set of curtains chosen together by a young couple furnishing their first flat. Standing in the aisle turning fabric samples over in their hands, imagining the room those curtains would eventually hang in. None of it was glamorous, all of it mattered. What was it precisely about a shop selling curtains and children's shoes that could lodge itself so deeply in a person's memory? Perhaps it was never really about the goods on the shelves at all. Perhaps it was about what a visit to BHS represented. Stability, routine, the reassurance of walking into a familiar space and knowing exactly where to find what you needed. By the late 1980s, British home stores stood at the height of its influence, its name printed onto shopping bags carried out of nearly every town center in the country. But behind the Sava Centre ambitions and the freshly designed shop fronts, the first quiet signs of strain were already beginning to show. Signs that, at the time, almost nobody thought to take seriously. The growth of British home stores through the 1970s and 1980s was never the product of a single dramatic decision. There was no boardroom moment where an executive slammed a fist on the table and declared the chain would conquer Britain. Instead, expansion crept forward steadily, store by store, decade by decade, the quiet accumulation of a company that understood its market and simply kept building on what worked. By the end of the 1960s, BHS operated 94 stores nationwide. Over the course of the 1970s, that number grew only modestly, a net addition of around 30 locations across the entire decade. But the pace of growth understates what was actually happening inside the business. This was not a company chasing volume for its own sake. Behind the scenes, British Home Stores was investing heavily in the unglamorous machinery that made a national retailer function. Distribution networks, data processing systems, back-office efficiency that competitors struggled to match. Analysts of the period praised BHS precisely for this quiet competence. Where rivals grew loudly, BHS grew carefully. That carefulness paid off in numbers that were difficult to ignore. Annual revenues climbed from $161.8 million in 1975 to $366.4 million by the turn of the decade, more than doubling in just 5 years, while pre-tax profits nearly 2.5 times over the same period. For a chain that outside observers sometimes dismissed as drab beside the polish of Marks and Spencer, the underlying business was performing with a discipline that belied its unglamorous reputation. The physical footprint of British Home Stores told its own story of Britain's changing retail landscape. Traditionally rooted on the high street, in the heart of town centers where generations of shoppers had always gone, BHS began following its customers into an entirely new kind of space during the 1970s and 1980s, the indoor shopping center. Stores opened in the newly built Broadway Shopping Center and in Lakeside, part of a wider migration across British retail as covered, climate-controlled malls began drawing footfall away from open-air high streets. For BHS, this was less a bold gamble than a necessary adaptation. Shoppers were changing where they wanted to spend their Saturdays, and a retailer that wished to remain relevant had little choice but to follow them indoors. Perhaps the most ambitious expansion of the era came not through opening more BHS stores at all, but through an entirely new joint venture. Partnering with the supermarket giant Sainsbury's, British Home Stores helped launch Sava Centre, a chain of American-style hypermarkets that fuse groceries with general merchandise under a single roof. It was a format Britain had barely seen before. Vast, ambitious, a single trip designed to replace several separate errands. For a company built on the modest instincts of a 1928 shilling store, backing something as sprawling as a hypermarket revealed just how far British Home Stores believed its future could stretch. Growth of this kind inevitably changed what it meant to work for the company. For staff at long-standing high street branches, expansion brought new opportunities. Promotions into management as new stores opened, transfers to shopping center locations, a sense that the company they had joined was still a place with a future in it. But it also brought new pressures. As BHS grew, so did the distance between the shop floor and head office decision-making. Store managers who had once run their branch with a large degree of local autonomy found themselves increasingly answering to standardized, centrally dictated policies on everything from stock layout to staffing levels. The efficient back-office systems that analysts praised were, from the perspective of someone stacking shelves in Doncaster or Plymouth, simply another layer of instructions handed down from London. By the early 1980s, this steady expansion collided head-on with a global recession that battered high street retailers across the country. It was the first real test of whether British Home Stores' careful, methodical growth could withstand genuine economic pressure, and the company's response, a wholesale reinvention of its image through Conran Associates, suggested that even a chain built on quiet competence understood it could not simply expand its way past changing times forever. The machine kept running, but somewhere in its gears, the first signs of friction were beginning to show. By the 1980s, British Home Stores had become something more than a successful retail chain. It had become a fixture of British life itself, a name so thoroughly woven into the rhythm of the year that most shoppers never stopped to think of it as a business at all. It was simply where you went. For toys at Christmas, for school shoes in September, for curtains when you moved into your first home, BHS had achieved the rarest thing a retailer can achieve. It had stopped being a choice and become a habit, passed down without anyone quite noticing it happening. That transmission between generations was perhaps the truest measure of BHS's cultural reach. Grandmothers who had first walked through BHS doors in the 1950s brought their own daughters in the 1970s, who in turn brought their children through the same aisles in the 1980s and 1990s. Three generations of the same family, standing in front of the same toy department shelves, separated by decades but united by the same small ritual. Nobody had to explain to a child why BHS mattered. They simply grew up knowing it was where Christmas began. The Conran Associates redesign of the early 1980s did more than modernize shopfronts. It repositioned BHS culturally, aligning the chain with the same clean, considered aesthetic that was making Habitat a name associated with good taste rather than mere thrift. For a company once dismissed as dowdy beside Marks and Spencer, this was a genuine reinvention. BHS stores in the mid-1980s felt current, deliberate, a retailer that understood what modern British homes wanted to look like, not simply what they could afford. Nowhere was BHS's national reach more visible than in its geography. From Brixton to Darlington, from town center high streets to the vast new indoor shopping centers at Broadway and Lakeside, BHS stores gave millions of people across England, Scotland, and Wales an identical experience of the same familiar brand. Whether a family lived in the industrial north or the commuter south, a trip to BHS looked and felt the same. The same toy department layout, the same pick and mix counter, the same reliable stock of home furnishings. In a country still deeply divided by regional identity, BHS offered something quietly unifying. A shopping experience that belonged to the whole nation, not merely to one corner of it. For the staff who worked inside these stores during the chain's peak years, there was a particular pride in being part of something this widely recognized. Long-serving employees spoke of BHS not simply as an employer, but as an institution they belonged to. The kind of job where a till operator might work the same counter for 15 years, greeting customers she had watched grow from children into parents themselves. The company's efficient back-office systems, so praised by industry analysts, gave staff at branch level a sense of working for an organization that, whatever its faults, at least knew what it was doing. And yet, for all its national presence, BHS's role in British life ran deeper than logistics or floor layouts. It was there in the Sava Center hypermarkets that turned Saturday shopping into a full day's outing. It was there in the quiet dignity of a wedding list assembled in the home furnishings department, in the school uniform bought new every autumn without fail, in the small, unremarkable acts of provision that make up the texture of ordinary family life. BHS did not need advertising campaigns or celebrity endorsements to earn this place in the national consciousness. It had simply been there, reliably for decade after decade, until being there was its entire identity. What does it take for a shop selling curtains and school shoes to become part of a country's collective memory? Perhaps nothing more than time and consistency and the quiet accumulation of a million small ordinary visits. By the end of the 1980s, British home stores stood at the absolute height of its cultural standing, trusted, familiar, seemingly permanent. But permanence, as history was about to prove, is rarely what it appears to be. Beneath the surface of this national institution, the first genuine cracks were already beginning to form. By the early 1990s, the very qualities that had once made British home stores feel dependable were starting to curdle into something less flattering. The Conran Associates redesign of the 1980s had bought the chain a decade of renewed relevance, but design alone could not settle a deeper question that was beginning to circulate among shoppers, journalists, and industry analysts alike. What exactly was BHS for anymore? Beside Marks and Spencer, the comparison that had followed BH since its earliest years, the chain was once again losing ground. Where M&S had built a reputation for quality that customers were willing to pay a premium for, BHS found itself caught in an uncomfortable middle ground. No longer the cut-price variety store of its Brixton origins, not quite the trusted quality name its 1980s makeover had promised. Industry observers who had once praised the chain's efficient back-office operations now reached for a harsher word to describe its high street presence: drab, dowdy. The very adjectives BHS had spent a decade and a considerable design budget trying to shed were creeping back into circulation. It was a slow, almost imperceptible decline, the kind that dramatic irony thrives on. The shopper walking into a BHS store in 1994 to buy her daughter's school shoes noticed nothing alarming. The shelves were stocked. The pick and mix counter still offered its familiar handful of sweets. The staff still knew her by name. From the customer's side of the till, BHS in the early 1990s looked exactly like the BHS she had always known. She had no way of seeing what industry analysts and company insiders were beginning to notice: that a retailer standing still in a market that was rapidly moving was already in trouble, even if the trouble had not yet reached the shop floor. Behind the counters, that trouble was becoming harder to ignore. As the decade wore on, BHS underwent a rapid and unsettling turnover in its chief executive's office. A parade of leadership changes that left staff and middle managers uncertain which strategy, if any, the company was actually committed to. Each new chief executive arrived with a fresh vision for reviving the brand. Each departed before that vision had time to take root. For employees who had spent years, sometimes decades, learning to work within BHS's carefully engineered systems, this instability at the top was its own quiet form of alarm, even if head office insisted publicly that all was well. The company's response to its faltering position took a familiar shape: retrenchment. Rather than chase bold new expansion, BHS's owner, Storehouse, made the decision to narrow its focus, concentrating resources on the two chains that still generated the most reliable revenue: BHS itself and Mother Care. It was a defensive move dressed up as strategic discipline, and it bought the company a further stretch of stability through the late 1980s and early 1990s. But retrenchment is rarely a growth strategy. It is more often the sound of a company quietly conceding that its best days of expansion are behind it. Even as store shelves remained stocked and shopping bags still carried the familiar BHS name out of every town center in Britain, the chain's underlying identity crisis went largely unnoticed by the ordinary customer. This was perhaps the most unsettling truth of the entire decade. A retailer can look completely unchanged from the outside, while the foundations beneath it are already shifting. How long could a brand this deeply woven into British life continue coasting on nostalgia and habit alone, without genuinely reinventing what it offered? Nobody working the tills in 1995 could have answered that question, but somewhere in the boardrooms above them, the answer was already being written, and it would arrive in a form far more dramatic than a simple loss of relevance. In the year 2000, British Home Stores changed hands in a deal that would, in hindsight, mark the beginning of the end. Sir Philip Green, already establishing himself as one of Britain's most aggressive retail dealmakers, acquired BH from Storehouse for £200 million. On paper, it looked like a straightforward transaction: an ambitious entrepreneur buying a tired but stable high street chain, presumably to invest in its revival. What followed over the next 15 years would become one of the most scrutinized chapters in the entire history of British retail. At first, the numbers suggested vindication. Within 2 years of Green's acquisition, BHS's pre-tax profits surged from $18.5 million to $94.8 million. And its pension scheme, which would later become the very symbol of the company's downfall, actually sat in surplus, $17.4 million in the black. Green supporters pointed to figures like these as proof of his retail instincts. Profits continued to hover around the $100 million mark annually through the early 2000s, and for a time, it seemed as though British Home Stores had found in its new owner exactly the revival it needed. But beneath those headline profits, something else was happening, something that would take years and a parliamentary inquiry to fully expose. As BHS saw generated cash, that cash did not stay inside the business, reinvested in stores, staff, or the pension promises made to thousands of long-serving employees. Instead, it began flowing outward in the form of dividends paid to Green and his family, and rental and interest payments on arrangements structured to benefit the company's ownership rather than the company itself. Over Green's 15 years in control, the total extracted this way would later be estimated at more than £580 million, nearly 3 times what he had paid to acquire the business in the first place. Meanwhile, the pension scheme that had briefly sat in healthy surplus began, quietly and steadily, to slip the other way. Pension regulators, watching the numbers shift over the course of the 2000s, repeatedly requested that contributions to the scheme be increased to keep pace with the promises made to BHS's thousands of employees and pensioners. Those requests met resistance. By the time Green's ownership of BHS drew to a close, the surplus of his early years had become a deficit stretching into the hundreds of millions of pounds, a debt owed not to a bank or a supplier, but to the ordinary workers who had spent their careers behind BHS tills, trusting that their retirement was being safely provided for. What did the people on the shop floor understand of any of this? Almost nothing at the time. To a till operator in Leeds or a stockroom worker in Cardiff, BHS in the mid-2000s looked much as it always had. Busy at Christmas, quiet in January, the same familiar rhythm of a British high street institution. The boardroom decisions reshaping the company's financial foundations were invisible to the very people whose futures depended on them. By 2014, the profits that had once justified Green's ownership had evaporated entirely. BHS was now a loss-making business, its physical stores increasingly tired, its digital presence lagging far behind the online retailers reshaping British shopping habits. Green, by his own later account, had been looking to offload BHS for some time, eager to draw a line under a business that had stopped serving its purpose within his wider retail empire. In March 2015, he found his buyer. Dominic Chappelle, a former Formula 3000 racing driver turned business investor, and a man who had been declared bankrupt on 3 separate occasions, led a consortium called Retail Acquisitions Limited in purchasing British home stores for a single pound. Not 200 million. Not even a modest fraction of that figure. £1 for a company employing over 11,000 people and carrying a pension liability already running into the hundreds of millions. The board of directors installed by Retail Acquisitions raised eyebrows even among seasoned observers of British retail. Alongside Chappelle sat a lawyer, a former director of a city finance house, and a former senior advisor to a German investment bank. A group with little collective experience of running a major department store chain, tasked nonetheless with turning around a business that had been bleeding money for years. They approached at least one high-profile candidate, the former chief executive of Thomas Cook, to chair the company. He declined. What Chappelle's consortium inherited was not simply a struggling retailer, but a company already carrying the weight of Green's 15 years of extraction. The task ahead, as one contemporary observer put it, was monumental. A business that had struggled to adapt to the digital age, faced mounting competition on every high street in the country, and now carried a pension deficit that dwarfed the price anyone had paid to own it. Inside company headquarters on Marylebone Road, the mood had shifted from cautious optimism to quiet dread. Senior staff who had watched successive rounds of management churn through the 2000s now watched a fresh set of owners with no retail pedigree attempt to steer BHS through its most precarious period yet. Some employees held on to hope that new ownership might mean new investment. Others, particularly those who had watched the pension deficit numbers circulate internally for years, understood with growing certainty that something was about to give. And who in all of this was supposed to protect the people who had built this company, the shop floor staff who had given BHS their careers, and the pensioners who had trusted its promises for decades? It was a question that regulators, journalists, and eventually a panel of members of parliament would spend years trying to answer. But in the final months of 2015, as Chappelle's team searched desperately for a way to keep the business afloat, that question had not yet been asked publicly. It was about to be, and loudly. By the beginning of 2016, the numbers behind British home stores had become impossible to disguise. The company was carrying debts of more than $1.3 billion, a figure that included a pension deficit estimated at somewhere between $350 million and $571 million, depending on which actuarial basis was used to calculate it. Whichever figure was closer to the truth, the scale of the problem dwarfed the single-pound Dominic Chappelle's consortium had paid to acquire the business less than a year earlier. On the 3rd of March 2016, BHS entered into a company voluntary arrangement, a restructuring process designed to let a struggling business keep trading by reducing what it owed to creditors, provided 75% of them agreed to the terms. For BHS, this meant asking landlords across the country to accept reduced rents on many of its stores. It also meant something far more consequential for the company's workforce. No further contributions would be paid into the pension schemes that thousands of current and former employees were relying on. The CVA passed. The immediate crisis of unpaid rent was deferred. But the pension schemes, already deep in deficit, were pushed into what regulators call an assessment period, the first formal step toward the Pension Protection Fund taking over and paying out compensation at reduced levels rather than the full pensions BHS had originally promised. For staff who had spent years watching leadership change, hands and profits turn to losses, the CVA felt like confirmation of what many had quietly suspected for months. Word moved quickly along the shop floor of stores from Glasgow to Southampton. Rents were being renegotiated, pension payments frozen, and the company's own management was now formally acknowledging, in a legal filing, that BHS could not meet its obligations as they stood. It was the kind of news that arrived not as a single dramatic announcement, but as a slow-building dread, passed from manager to supervisor to till operator over the course of a single working week. The CVA bought British Home Stores less than 2 months. On the 25th of April, 2016, the company filed for administration. The formal declaration that BHS could no longer pay its debts and needed external administrators to take control of its affairs. It was, in the words of one industry commentator, the biggest collapse of a British retailer since Woolworths had gone under in 2008. 11,000 jobs were placed immediately at risk. The headquarters on Marylebone Road, once the nerve center of a national retail chain, became the site of a very different kind of gathering. Journalists outside the door, administrators inside going through the accounts, and staff inside wondering, for the first time with real fear, whether they would still have a job by the summer. For customers, the change was, at first, barely visible. Stores stayed open, shelves stayed stocked. A shopper popping into her local BHS in early May 2016 might have read the headlines about administration without connecting them yet to any real disruption in her own high street routine. That, too, was part of the dramatic irony of the collapse, the gap between what was unfolding in boardrooms and courtrooms and what was still, for a few more weeks, visible on the shop floor. Administrators spent the following 2 months searching for a buyer willing to take on us BHS as a going concern, someone who might preserve at least some of the stores and some of the jobs under new ownership. Retail rescues of this kind were not unheard of. Other struggling chains had in the past found last-minute buyers willing to gamble on a smaller, leaner version of the business surviving. For BHS, that rescue never materialized. In June 2016, administrators announced that no viable buyer had come forward and that the company would instead be wound down entirely. The following month, the announcement that so many BHS employees had feared and so many customers had not yet imagined was made official. All 164 remaining stores across the United Kingdom would close. British Home Stores, present on the country's high streets in one form or another since 1928, would disappear from them completely. What followed was a version of retail few shoppers had witnessed on this scale before. The liquidation sale. Store by store, the familiar layouts that customers had known for decades were stripped down and marked for clearance. Signs reading up to 50% off, then 70, then more, appeared in windows that had once displayed Christmas toy catalogs and carefully arranged home furnishings. Shelves that had been restocked every week for generations grew steadily barer, fixtures and fittings themselves eventually put up for sale alongside the last of the stock. Longtime customers wandering through these final clearance sales described an eerie, almost funereal atmosphere. Familiar spaces being dismantled in real time. A shop stripped not just of its merchandise, but gradually of its identity. For staff, the experience was harder still. Many had worked for BHS for 10, 20, even 30 years. Some of the very till operators and department managers who had once been praised for building lasting relationships with their regular customers now found themselves serving out redundancy notices instead of Christmas rushes. Beyond the loss of employment itself, Thousands of current and former workers face the harsher reality buried inside the pension deficit. The Pension Protection Fund's compensation would not match what BHS had originally promised. Workers who had planned their retirements around decades of steady contributions now faced a future with meaningfully less than they had been told to expect. On the 13th of August 2016, the flagship Oxford Street branch, for decades among the most prominent BHS stores in the country, standing on one of the most famous shopping streets in the world, closed its doors for the final time. It was for many the symbolic end of the story, even as a handful of other locations wound down their own final days across the weeks that followed. There was no grand ceremony, no farewell address from company leadership. Administrators oversaw an orderly, unsentimental closure, the practical conclusion to a legal process, rather than the emotional send-off a 90-year-old British institution might have seemed to deserve. The press coverage that accompanied the collapse was extensive and increasingly pointed. Newspapers that had once run features on BHS's Conran-designed stores now ran investigations into Sir Philip Green's 15 years of ownership, his extraction of hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends, and the pension deficit left behind for Dominic Chappelle's short-lived £1 ownership to inherit. Members of Parliament announced a formal inquiry determined to establish precisely how a company with BHS's history and scale had been allowed to fail so completely and so quickly under the stewardship of men who had profited from it long before its collapse. For the 11,000 people who lost their jobs, and the many thousands more who had built their retirements around BHS's promises, the headlines offered little practical comfort. What remained once the liquidation sales ended and the last shutters came down was simply absence. High streets across Britain missing a shop front that had stood in one form or another for 88 years. Something that had felt permanent had proven in the end that nothing in retail ever truly is. In the immediate aftermath of BHS's collapse, the question on everyone's mind was not simply what had happened, but who would be held accountable for it. That accountability arrived first through Parliament. A joint inquiry by the Business, Innovation and Skills Committee and the Work and Pensions Committee summoned Sir Philip Green to give evidence, alongside Dominic Chappelle and the small circle of advisors who had orbited BHS's final chaotic year. The resulting report was unsparing. MPs concluded that Green had effectively left BHS on life support before selling it for a single pound, extracting hundreds of millions of pounds in value while leaving behind a pension deficit that would ultimately be shouldered by the Pension Protection Fund and by the thousands of ordinary workers whose retirements depended on it. The public pressure that followed was considerable. Green, previously celebrated in the press as one of Britain's most successful retail entrepreneurs, found his reputation transformed almost overnight into a symbol of everything critics believed was wrong with modern corporate ownership. Calls for him to be stripped of his knighthood circulated widely, debated in newspaper columns and in the House of Commons itself, even as the more immediate, practical question remained unresolved. What would actually happen to the pensions of the 20,000 people affected by the scheme's collapse? After sustained public and regulatory pressure, Green eventually agreed to contribute a substantial sum toward plugging the pension gap, a settlement that eased but did not entirely erase the shortfall left behind. For the physical spaces BHS left empty, the story was less about scandal and more about the quiet, uneven process of a high street absorbing a sudden, gaping loss. Some flagship locations in city centers with strong footfall found new occupants relatively quickly. Other retailers, or increasingly alternative uses altogether, as more and more town centers grappled with the broader decline of traditional department store shopping. Other BHS units, particularly in smaller or already struggling towns, sat empty for years, their shuttered fronts becoming an unmissable physical reminder of the collapse for anyone walking past. The BHS name itself did not disappear entirely from public life. In September 2016, the Al Maya Group, a business based in the Middle East, purchased the intellectual property rights to British home stores from the administrators and relaunched BHS.com as an online retailer for the UK market, while continuing to operate a small number of physical BHS stores across the Middle East and parts of Africa. It was a faint echo of the original chain, rather than any genuine revival. By June 2018, Almayer Group had closed the UK website altogether, choosing to focus its efforts elsewhere, and the BHS name effectively receded from British commercial life for good. The broader lesson that BHS's collapse offered the retail industry extended well beyond one company's mismanagement. It became, for many analysts and commentators, the defining case study of a particular era in British corporate ownership, one in which private equity-style financial engineering could be applied to a household retail name, extracting value for owners while leaving employees and pensioners to absorb the consequences when the underlying business could no longer support the debt and obligations placed upon it. The specific mechanics of BHS's fall, dividend extraction, sale-leaseback arrangements, a pension scheme allowed to slip from surplus into catastrophic deficit, would be cited for years afterward whenever similar warning signs appeared at other struggling high street names. For the communities that had depended on BHS as an employer and a retail anchor, the economic impact rippled outward long after the headlines faded. 11,000 redundancies did not simply vanish into new employment overnight, particularly for older workers who had built careers around a single company and now faced a job market that had changed considerably since they had last searched for work. Town centers that lost a BHS unit often lost, alongside it, a portion of the footfall that had once sustained neighboring shops. The cafes, the smaller retailers, the businesses that had relied indirectly on BHS drawing shoppers into that part of the high street in the first place. Former employees scattered in every direction that a sudden redundancy allows. Some found new roles in retail, at chains still standing, carrying with them decades of institutional knowledge about stock, customers, and the particular rhythms of a British department store. Others left the industry altogether, unwilling or unable to start again in a sector that suddenly felt far less secure than it had seemed only a year before. For the pensioners whose retirement plans had been quietly eroded over 15 years of ownership changes, the settlement eventually reached offered some relief, but rarely full restoration of what had originally been promised. What does it mean for a country when an institution like this disappears? Not through some inevitable failure of the idea itself, but through 15 years of decisions made by owners who no longer needed the business to survive in order to profit from it. British home stores did not fall because shoppers stopped wanting curtains or school shoes or a quiet Saturday wandering the toy department. It fell because the company built to serve them was for over a decade treated as something to be extracted from rather than invested in. That distinction between a business run for its customers and a business run for its owners would go on to define how Britain understood retail collapse for years to come. Somewhere in Britain tonight, a woman in her 60s is describing to her granddaughter what it felt like to walk into BHS in December, the toy department lit up and humming with the particular anticipation that only Christmas can bring. She is describing the paper bag of pick and mix, weighed out sweet by sweet at the counter, the twist of white paper handed over like something precious. She is describing the curtains she chose there once, standing in an aisle with a young man who would become her husband, the two of them turning fabric samples over in their hands, imagining a room that did not yet exist. Her granddaughter will never smell that shop, never feel the particular texture of its carpet under her school shoes, never queue at that till. But she will understand, from the way it is told, that something real once stood there. British home stores was never simply a place to buy things. It was a place where the ordinary business of family life quietly unfolded, year after year, without anyone ever thinking to remark on it at the time. It was there for the school uniform bought new every September, the wedding list assembled by two people just starting out, the small unspoken understanding between a till operator and a regular customer who had been coming in for so many years that neither needed to explain who they were. It asked for nothing beyond a shilling, then a little more, and gave back something that no receipt could ever fully account for. The sense walking in through those doors that you belonged there, that this was a shop built with people like you in mind. What made a shop like this matter was never the toys or the curtains or the pick and mix, not really. It was what those things allowed to happen around them. A father who could not otherwise afford much found, in the shilling prices of 1928, a way to bring something home that his family needed. A grandmother in the 1970s found in the toy department a small ritual she could pass down to her daughter and her daughter's daughter after that. A young couple in the 1980s found, in the home furnishings aisle, the first quiet decisions of a life they were building together. None of it was extraordinary on its own. All of it, taken together, across 90 years and generations of families who never knew each other's names, amounted to something that deserved to be called an institution. Not because it was grand, but because it was faithfully, reliably there. It is easy, looking back, to reduce a story like this to numbers, to debts, deficits, dividends, the careful arithmetic of who took what and when. Those numbers matter, and they will be remembered by historians and regulators for as long as anyone studies how a company can be hollowed out while still standing. But the numbers were never what people carried out of a BHS store on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. What they carried out was smaller and, in its way, larger than any figure on a balance sheet, the memory of a place that had been there for their parents, and would, they assumed, without ever quite saying it aloud, simply go on being there for their own children too. That assumption, in the end, was the thing that history proved wrong. Nothing in retail is ever truly permanent, however deeply it may be woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. British home stores opened in a modest Brixton shop front in 1928 and closed 88 years later on a high street that had changed almost beyond recognition from the one it was born into. In between those 2 points stood generations of workers who gave the best of their careers behind its tills, and generations of customers who gave the shop, in return, the quiet loyalty of a habit passed down without ever needing to be explained. It deserves to be remembered honestly, not as a perfect story and not as a simple tragedy either, but as what it actually was. A shop that mattered enormously to the people who walked through its doors, for reasons that had very little to do with commerce and everything to do with the ordinary, unremarkable business of building a life. The workers who kept its shelves stocked for decades deserve to be remembered. The founders who first believed that ordinary British families deserved good, honest goods at a fair price deserve to be remembered. And the millions of shoppers who filled its aisles, one Saturday at a time, across 9 decades, deserve to know that the story was worth telling, and that what they remember was, in every sense that matters, real.